Good evening, everybody. We will be recording this video. It's a great pleasure to see you, to know that we've got so many people. This is a sold out talk, which is absolutely fantastic and says something about the credentials of our great friend and supporter, Andrew Field. Now, how can I put this? Andrew, as you know, is a man who basically brought the French to Waterloo in the sense of actually say, read the French accounts. And I don't think anybody can profess to being, interested in this campaign if they have not got Andrew's 3 books. He's also been and talked to us on the Imperial Guard at Waterloo. That was also a sellout talk last year. And now he's moving very much into the contribution of Wellington and his allies, for which he's going to talk about this evening. And he's going to deal with that person who, of course, no one has ever said anything good about. And of course, Sharp was quite right to shoot him. And also, hopefully, Andrew will tell us where Sharp shot the Prince of Orange. But Andrew, sir, I'm going to let you, without further ado, share screen. Of course, good people, any comments or any questions, please fling them on the chat. And I have remembered what I got wrong when I did my talk in December. I have enabled you to actually use a chat today instead of stopping it. So, Andrew, sir, over to you, ready to share screen, away you go.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Let's see if we can get this going. That's proving a... there we go. Okay, well, as the saying goes...
Andrew, that's perfect, sir.
Yeah.
You've got your full screen.
Thank you. Good. Well, I think John's just stolen my sandwiches, as they say, for my introduction, really. But I'm going to go ahead. Anyway. Well, as John said, the Prince of Orange seems to be someone that not many people know much about. Perhaps you know that he commanded at Quattre, perhaps that he was responsible for the destruction of the British 69th at that battle, that he held some command perhaps at Waterloo, and that he was wounded at the battle. But I think what most people seem to know is that he's generally described or portrayed in English histories at least as an arrogant and incompetent military commander. Well, of course, the question is this fair? Well, nothing has done more harm to his reputation, really, than this chap here. This is a character, of course, portraying him in Bernard Cornwell's Sharp's Waterloo, in which it was Sharp that shot him to prevent him from causing any more British soldier deaths. Now, in Bernard Cornwell's novel, he's portrayed as a bumbling, incompetent, upper-class twit. Unfortunately, even in Bernard Cornwell's serious history of the battle, he's portrayed rather the same and referred to throughout rather reverently by his nickname of Slender Billy. But even more serious British histories portray him as a sort of grossly over-promoted and militarily inexperienced youth whose incompetence and lack of tactical understanding sent many soldiers to their deaths. So my aim this evening is here. And this is how I plan to go about it. I'm going to look first of all at his background, his youth really, and his initial introduction to military training, his early career as an aide-de-camp to Wellington in Spain. And then once he finishes in Spain and moves back, if you like, to the Netherlands, we're going to look at him from when he returns to the start of the Waterloo campaign, then his performance at Waterloo and Quattre Bras, a very short time about what happened to him after Waterloo, and then we'll come to some sort of conclusion. I'll give you my feeling about how I look at the evidence that I will have presented to you. And I will try to be as objective as I possibly can. I think some of you will feel I've been objective. I think others of you will feel that I'm tipping one way or the other. But I have tried to be as objective as I can in presenting the evidence, if you like, both for and against him. So let's start with his background. As you can see, he's born in 1792 in The Hague. Interestingly, a lot of histories have him down as 23 at Waterloo. As you can see, his birthday was in December, and therefore he was actually 22 at Waterloo. By then, he was also a full general in the British Army. Not that this was particularly exceptional amongst the royalty and the nobility of that age. His father was this chap. He was the third son of the last stadtholder, William V, who ruled the United Provinces before the French revolutionary armies invaded in 1795, after which invasion he lived in exile in Prussia, spent some time fighting against the French, before he was invited back to the Netherlands by the provisional government after it had been liberated by the Allies in 1813. He was then to become King Willem I of the Netherlands, as it says at the bottom there. Okay, back to the Prince of Orange. He left in 1794 as the French revolutionary armies marched through Belgium. He went first of all to England and then to Prussia. And in 1805, he attended the Prussian Military Academy, passing out from there in 1809, being commissioned into the Prussian army, aged just 16. Once he'd finished there, he went to Oxford University, where he spent 2 years studying law. And so in 1811, when he finished his studies there, he was commissioned into the British Army as a lieutenant colonel and embarked for Spain. When he was commissioned, he wrote in his journal, "I have the honour of wearing for the first time the uniform of the first army in the world. Hurrah, hurrah." And through his time, through the military academy and through Spain, he was accompanied by his long-term mentor, this chap, Constant Rebecque. He's quite an interesting chap in himself. He had served in a Swiss regiment in French service to begin with, but then left them and joined the British Army. And ironically enough, he stayed with the Prince really throughout the rest of his military career, up to and including Waterloo. And I'm sure many of you know that at Waterloo, Constant Rebecque served as the Chief Staff of the Netherlands Army. In the memorandum on the Dutch Army, which was believed to be written for Wellington by Colonel Colborne, who was then military secretary to the Prince, it seems that he was well regarded by the British senior officers, and this is what it said about him. Okay, let's move on to Spain then. The picture on the right, you can see Wellington rather overdressed, I think, for campaign in the middle. And to his left, that represents the Prince of Orange in his British uniform, acting as his aide-de-camp. But he wasn't actually sent out there as Wellington's aide-de-camp. He was sent out there without really knowing what job he was to do. Having arrived on the 21st of June, 1811, in August, Wellington wrote the following back to the Horse Guards. So Wellington was recommending that the Prince of Orange should serve in a brigade, because that is where he would learn his business. Because of course, until this time, although he'd been commissioned for some years already, he had no sort of military experience, no campaign experience, and certainly no command experience. And there is a chance that by working at the brigade level, he would have started to really understand low-level tactics. And I don't think anyone could argue that that would have been a good thing for him. However, as you probably know, as I've already said, he decided not to do that. Now, it might have been that it was felt to be too risky, but clearly Wellington didn't think so. Or maybe it was just that the Prince chose not to take that opportunity, preferring to serve close to Wellington. And I don't know what the answer to that is. However, even as an ADC, he was going to see plenty of action in the 2 years that he served in the Peninsula. So in 1811, he was promoted to colonel, and he was present at the action of Elboden. The following year, he was at the storming of Ciudad Rodrigo, in which he followed up the Forlorn Hope in the assault and was grazed by a ball on a mission after that initial assault. At Badajoz, again, he was in the midst of the assault, where he was noted encouraging the troops and helped to carry some of the wounded to the rear. He was also present at the great victory of Salamanca and also at the abortive siege, really, of Burgos towards the end of that year. The following year, in 1813, he was present at Vitoria, at the siege of San Sebastian, the crossing of the Bidasoa, and the Battle of Nivelle. And so you can see that in that time, in those 2 years he was there, he saw plenty of action. He had also had a horse shot under him at the action of Sororan. So no one can argue that he didn't see action while he was out in Spain. And then towards the end of 1813, with the impending liberation of the Netherlands by the Allies, primarily the Prussians and the Russians, he requested to leave Spain to join the Prussians, bearing in mind he was a Prussian officer, to fight against the French. But this was rejected by the British government. And I can only imagine it was because the British government wanted him to remain within the British sphere of influence. And I'll touch on this again a little bit later. So it was only at the very end of November 1813 that he departed Spain for Britain. So those 2 years of activity in Spain, I'd just like to sort of give a quick summary. So first of all, he was recommended detachment to a brigade, but this wasn't taken up. And so he served for 2 years as Wellington's aide-de-camp. During this time, he saw plenty of action and gained some important operational experience. And he was praised by Wellington in his official correspondence. And then he was quite well regarded by others. A British staff officer who worked in Wellington's headquarters in the Peninsula wrote, "He was generally considered a weak young man, but was not deficient in courage." And later, the same author said, he became popular by his quiet and unassuming manners. So certainly very courageous and actually a nice chap. And that's not the sort of picture that we get either from Sharp or perhaps from many British histories either. At the end of 1812, so before he left the peninsula, a year before he left the peninsula, again, Wellington wrote back the following. Now, the medal to which Wellington referred in that dispatch was the Army Gold Medal, which you can see here. And these are the actions on the left at which he was present that Wellington mentioned in that correspondence, each of which qualified him for a clasp on the medal. And you can see the medal on the right obviously is not his medal, but you can see the clasp for the battles that the wearer of that medal was present at. The gold medal was awarded only to field officers, so majors and above, and general officers for successful commands in battle. So as Wellington stated in his letter, the prince was not actually qualified for the medal as he held no command. Now, once an officer had qualified for 4 clasps, and so for the prince after he had served at Vitoria, the round medal, if you like, that we saw in the previous slide was exchanged for a cross. And the 4 battle honours which you had were then engraved on each arm of the cross, if you like, as you can see on the right there. And then in further honours, as the ones on the left show that the prince was at, those would have been added to the ribbon as clasps. So he finished his time also having been decorated. And if you look at the picture on the right, you can see he's actually wearing his gold medal, the round one. So that dates it before he fought at some of the later actions. But interestingly, I see there are no clasps on it. And so I'm not quite sure why that is, but you can see it with his gold medal on the picture there. But I think most importantly, when we come to assess him as a military commander, he had no command experience. He'd seen action, he'd been in working in the headquarters, where he started to understand how an army headquarters would work, but he had no real command at the lower levels, which all other British officers would have had. Okay, so let's move on to the next phase, if you like, and this is his return back to the UK, back to Britain to start with in December 1813, and then back to the Netherlands and up to the beginning of the Waterloo campaign. Now, he returned to London, as I said, at the end of November 1813, in anticipation, actually, of his engagement to Princess Charlotte of Wales, but that didn't happen, and therefore he then quickly moved on back to the Netherlands, as you can see, in December of that year. Now, he arrived in The Hague in the middle of December, and was immediately nominated as a general in the Netherlands service and major general in the British Army. As commander of the Dutch field forces at that time, he was responsible for overseeing the reduction of the final French garrisons that were still in the Netherlands, or the United Provinces as it was then, and Belgium. And then, what's that, 8 months or so later, he was promoted to Lieutenant General in the British Army, and then just a month later, or less than a month later, commander of the British forces in Belgium, and then full general in the British Army. So that was pretty meteoric rise from colonel in 1813, at the end of 1813, to full general in the British Army in the middle of 1814. In February 1815, the Kingdom of the United Netherlands was formed as a result of the Congress of Vienna. And so what we now know as the Netherlands and Belgium, and also the Bishopric of Liège, were all brought together under William I, or Willem I, the Prince of Orange's father, to become the Kingdom of the United Netherlands. And because his father became king, and his father was really the Prince of Orange at that time, then obviously then the Prince of Orange became formally, he had the formal title of the Prince of Orange rather than the hereditary prince. As such, he worked as a go-between, really, between Wellington and King Willem, who was making a few problems for Wellington. And so, because Wellington knew the Prince of Orange so well, the Prince of Orange worked as a sort of intermediary between the two in the negotiations that went on in the organisation and the supply and so on of Wellington's army, which was based, of course, in the Netherlands. Okay. Finally, 23rd of March, so only 3 days after Napoleon arrived in Paris, having come back from his first exile, the Prince of Orange was nominated as a commander-in-chief of the Allied troops in the United Netherlands. So effectively, the army that was later become Wellington's army, and very much an Allied army, the Prince of Orange was nominated to command that. Now, in this appointment, he was not highly regarded by many of the men or the senior British officers who'd served with him when he was only a colonel in the peninsula. In April 1815, the Prince had a meeting with General Rowland Hill. And about this meeting, Rowland Hill's aide-de-camp wrote the following. So if that was the impression that General Lord Hill got about him, perhaps it was no surprise that soon after that, the British decided to appoint some fairly trusted men to keep an eye on him. And two of these well-known figures, General Clinton and Colonel Sir John Colborne. Now, General Clinton was appointed as the second in command of the army there, and John Colborne, later famous for his command of the 52nd at Waterloo, was appointed as the Prince's military secretary. Now, unfortunately, neither of them had very much good to say of the Prince, but there is a danger when we try and look sort of objectively at how the Prince performed during this time, that there is a danger that both of these men felt somewhat jealous, perhaps working for a relatively inexperienced and foreign 22-year-old. And so there may be a certain touch of jealousy in some of the things, some of the correspondence, let's say, that followed. Indeed, Colborne wrote that he was not fit to command an army. Now, some contemporary accounts certainly seem to support the notion that he'd made himself unpopular with the army. I mean, Ensign Macready, so actually a junior officer in the 30th Foot, wrote in his memoirs, "The Prince of Orange kept us hard at work. He prepared for a campaign by filling the hospitals. Twice a week, we marched 10 miles to the east of Castres, near Mons, and we were drilled in corps or divisions. These parades with our return to quarters often lasted from 3 in the morning until 6 in the afternoon. Here we were drilled out of all patience, and like the soldiers of ancient Rome, I longed for war as a release from fatigue. His Royal Highness of Orange continued to annoy us and increased the sick list by his detestable drills." Now, Clinton wrote to his brother, complaining that by promoting the prince to such high rank, that it was very difficult to reverse any of the unfortunate decisions that the prince had made. And so Clinton wrote, "The impolicy of appointing so incompetent a person to the command of an army had now been made apparent. And having given the Prince of Orange the rank of general in our service, they cannot supersede him but by the person of Lord Wellington, without displacing him. And so the army is exposed to all the dangers of his inexperience. It is impossible for more to have been done to harass the troops, to excite the contempt of officers, and to destroy the confidences which all were at first disposed to feel in the presence of our army. Our good fortune has been our good fortune has been that the enemy has not been in a state to take advantage of our calamities, and the arrival of the Duke of Wellington will be considered as now applying the remedy, as if he was not only the only general fit to command an army, but the only one capable of keeping it from falling into confusion." Now, that is fairly damning, but like I say, you must bear in mind that these were quite senior people operating below a sort of a 22-year-old by that time. And so that must have been quite galling, certainly to someone with Clinton's experience, having commanded divisionally in the peninsula. Now, the British government was also concerned that while he was in command and before Wellington turned up, that he might make some sort of rash decision to open the campaign early and sort of drive an offensive into France, hoping that he would catch Napoleon before he was ready. And Colborne noted that the government wrote to him, quote, "begging me to prevent the prince from engaging in any affair of his own before the combined operations." Now, probably much to his own relief, Colborne retook command of the 52nd in the middle of May 1815. Now, on the 5th of May 1815, Wellington was nominated as the supreme commander of the Allied army. And this is what the prince wrote to him. Now, looking at what I've highlighted in red, you can't help but wonder whether he rather arrogantly believed that he was better qualified to command an army than the many British generals that were serving with the army, who commanded both in battle and on campaign throughout the Peninsular War. But anyway, the prince lost his command as a commander-in-chief of the army, and he was nominated to command the First Corps within Wellington's army. Now, this, as you can see, was quite a strong corps consisting of 2 British divisions. The first division, of course, being the Guards division, so quite a strong and elite division. 2 Netherlands infantry divisions and the Netherlands cavalry division. Now, it appears quite a responsible command, but it seems evident that the core system in Wellington's army was more of administrative rather than tactical significance. Wellington's headquarters continued to give orders directly to the individual British divisions within the army. And it goes without saying, really, that this was a rather awkward arrangement, as during the period in the run-up to the breakout of hostilities, divisions were receiving conflicting orders from their corps headquarters, from the Prince of Orange, and from Wellington's headquarters. And we see examples of this even on the sort of the 16th of June in the run up to Quatre Bras. Okay, now this map shows the concentration areas of the Allied and Prussian armies at the opening of the campaign. The dotted line that is sort of at the bottom of the map shows the border between France and Belgium. Now, this is the Prince's first corps, so sort of in the front line, if you like, and just to the southeast is the main road that runs from France up to Brussels, which is actually the axis that the French took. Of course, Wellington was far more concerned about an advance from Mons, which was further to the west. Now, you can see that the front of that advance was screened by the Prussian First Corps, and therefore you would expect that the first fighting was conducted by the Prussians against the French, and of course this was indeed the case. But as the French pressured the Prussians, they withdrew to the northeast and concentrated with the rest of their army around Ligny, which of course was where they fought the battle against Napoleon on the 16th. And this meant that the main road that led up to Brussels became almost open to the French advance. And it was only sort of very much the Eastern Brigade of the First Corps that were the only Allied troops blocking that route. Now, on receipt of the information that the French were advancing up this road, arriving at his headquarters, the Prince of Orange chose to ride to Brussels himself to inform Wellington that hostilities had broken out. Now, normally you would have expected the Prince to send one of his aides de camp to give that information, because as you can see, once the Prussians had withdrawn to the northeast, you know, the First Corps were in the front line. And in fact, on the evening of the 15th, some of the Prince's troops were in action on that Brussels road. And yet the Prince had chosen to leave his headquarters and travel up to Brussels. So that seems to me somewhat of a strange decision, and something really that he should not have done, and he should have stayed with his corps. And of course, one of the attractions of going back up to Brussels from his headquarters at Braine-le-Comte was, of course, the Duchess of Richmond's ball. Now, Dutch accounts state, or some of them state, that it was actually Wellington that persuaded the Prince to stay at Brussels and attend the ball rather than travel back down to join his corps. And certainly you would have expected the Prince to want to go down there as his troops were in action, but he decided to stay. And on the morning of the 16th, it was only the 2nd Netherlands Division that were at Quatre Bras. So the decision to deploy them there was made by Constant Rebec, the Chief of Staff, because the Prince wasn't there to make that decision. Wellington's concentration orders had ordered the Netherlands troops, the 2nd Netherlands Division, to concentrate at Nivelles further to the west. But it was Constant Rebec and the divisional commander, Peponchet, who decided that Wellington clearly didn't have an accurate view of what the French were doing and where they were advancing, and therefore they made the unilateral decision to move the 2nd Netherlands Division to block the French advance at Quatre Bras. And needless to say, that decision should have really been from the Prince of Orange, but he was in Brussels. Now, of course, after the ball, or late in the evening as the ball was going on, the Prince left Brussels to go back to his troops. But by that time, that decision, which was a key decision in the campaign, as I'm sure many of you know, had already been taken. So let's then join the Prince at Quatre Bras on the morning of the 16th. Now, this map shows the initial deployment of the 2nd Netherlands Division at Quatre Bras. Now, although the slide at the bottom shows the French advance at 2 o'clock, as you can see, the deployment then was the same as when Wellington arrived at Quatre Bras to join the Prince at about 10 a.m. on the morning of the battle, so the 16th of June. Now, on his arrival, the prince took the Duke around his position, showing him the deployment of the 2nd Netherlands Division, and down, or should I say up, onto the high ground at the very south of the slide that you can see there, the map onto the Balkan Heights, where Wellington and the Prince of Orange could look down towards the village of Frasne, around which the forward troops were concentrating. And so Wellington was able to see the forward French troops. Now, because Ney, who commanded the French, had been slow in concentrating his troops, there was not much to be seen. And Wellington left after this meeting to go and meet up with Field Marshal Blücher, with the Prussians over at Ligny, because he was firmly of the opinion that the French were not going to attack Quattre Bras, but were concentrating the whole of their army to fight the Prussians across at Ligny. Now, again, in many histories, certainly Dutch ones, you will see that the Dutch see the fact that Wellington did not alter the deployment of any of the prince's troops, as if you like, as showing that the prince had done a good job. Right? The truth is, Wellington did not believe that the French were going to attack at Quattre Bras. So, looking at the deployment here, you can see that if you like, the Prince of Orange's mission was to hold the crossroads at Quattre Bras, and of course, until, if the French attacked, until reinforcements from the rest of Wellington's army marched down the main road from Brussels or from across from Nivelles to reinforce him. And so what he tried to do was to hide his true strength in sort of Wellingtonian style and to impose upon the French and hold them up. Now, he wanted to make the French believe there were much stronger forces, particularly hidden in the Bossu Wood, and therefore the French would be slow to develop an attack against those. However, what he did is by doing this is he put 4 battalions plus in front of the Bossu Wood that you can see on the left there, and only 1.5 battalions in the open, or the more open ground to the east or to the right of the Brussels Road, as you can see. And then he kept quite a strong reserve, very sensibly, a strong reserve back at Quattre Bras. So that was presumably, well, that was his initial thinking. Now, the problem with this deployment is, for me, is that the French wanted to press up the Brussels Road as quickly as possible and get to Brussels as quickly as possible, and to hold Quattre Bras, because that's the orders that Napoleon had given Ney. Now, because the French tended to advance in column and therefore try to advance as quickly as possible, the French actually weren't interested in fighting their way through the Bossu Wood. What they wanted to do was take the shortest, quickest, most open route that was available to them to get themselves to Quattre Bras as quickly as possible. And so actually the concentration of the French forces was actually in the center, where the Prince had the least number of troops. He was therefore, as the French finally got to advance in the afternoon, about 2 o'clock, he was very quickly forced to send down a couple of battalions from his reserve to reinforce his front line. And you can see there that the 7th Line Battalion, which is a Belgian battalion, and the 5th Dutch militia was sent to fill in the gap, if you like, between the farm of Guemioncourt and the Bossu Wood. But of course, the Dutch were, or the Netherlands troops, were considerably outnumbered. There was a single division of them, quite a strong division, about 8,000 troops, but they had very little artillery, 2 batteries, and no cavalry. Whereas Ney had immediately available 2 divisions, so twice as many infantry, had a division of cavalry, to which the Netherlands troops had no answer, and a much stronger force of artillery. So it was no surprise that the Netherlands troops were pushed back by the French advance. There was a real danger that Quattre Bras was going to be lost, but it was really just at that key moment that a cavalry brigade, a Netherlands cavalry brigade, arrived on the battlefield. the 5th Light Dragoons and the 6th Hussars. And almost before they'd had chance to draw breath from their march to the battlefield, they were launched against the French advance. And although they were quite heavily defeated by the French cavalry, they had bought the time for more reinforcements to arrive. Picton's division, as you can see there, but also the Brunswick troops, or some of the Brunswick troops, also arrived. And if you like, those forces saved Wellington from losing the crossroads. By 3:30, as you can see there, the Netherlands troops had been fighting for a couple of hours, had been pretty much overwhelmed by the French advance. And now that reinforcements are arriving, Wellington took the Netherlands troops out of the front line and gave them time to reorganize and rest behind the line. And the arriving Brunswick and British troops and Hanoverian troops took up the fight. And so from that time onwards, the Netherlands troops took very little part in any of the fighting, which went on until well into the evening, 9 or even 10 o'clock. Now, of course, by this time, Wellington had arrived to take command of the battle, and the Prince, therefore, had gone back to taking command of the 1st Corps. And in fact, it was the 1st Corps provided most of the troops that had arrived on the battlefield. Now, let's have a quick look at how the Prince is portrayed at the battle. As I say, his division was grossly outnumbered by the French, and therefore it was a fairly hopeless task. And so he finally was driven back towards Quattre. But he certainly took a central role in commanding the Netherlands troops, and he's described by eyewitnesses as getting around the battlefield, encouraging and motivating the troops, and even leading counterattacks. The courage he displayed during the battle is certainly indisputable. Indeed, he was almost captured by a French cavalry charge, which cut down one of his aides de camp and who was left for dead. And probably this print might be familiar to many of you. One of the early stories that came from the battle is represented in this print, which shows him offering one of his own personal decorations to a Netherlands unit. In fact, that unit was the 7th Belgian Line Battalion, and it's said that he awarded it to the battalion for saving him from this French cavalry attack. However, there is some doubt as to whether this actually took place, but whether it's the truth or whether it's myth, the story served primarily as a sort of useful piece of propaganda aimed at praising the courage of the Belgians in an effort to encourage their loyalty to the new state of the United Netherlands. Many Belgians were not happy being incorporated into this new kingdom. And I think it's fair to say that the Prince had a pretty good battle. His troops, led and inspired by him, had fought hard against superior numbers, albeit not with complete success. With Wellington's arrival, as I say, his role as the commander of the 1st Corps now took over, and he spent the rest of the day in command of his troops. Now, at the end of the day, as the day began to draw to an end, Marshal Ney, the French commander, in frustration at having failed to capture Quattre, ordered one last desperate gamble. He called for General Kellerman and ordered him to charge the Allied line with his 2 regiments of cuirassiers. Now, Kellerman ordered his men forwards, and at this time, the Allied deployment is shown on the slide. And just to the east of the main road stood the 2nd Battalion of the 69th, the South Lincolns. Now, they were standing in line when they were warned of the approach of French cavalry, and the battalion was ordered to form square. Now, at this moment, the Prince of Orange arrived. Now, of course, depending on which histories you read, the detail of what happened next varies, but essentially the end result was the same. The Prince of Orange challenged the commanding officer as to why he was forming into square. He said he'd been warned of the approach of French cavalry, which could not be seen at that point. So the Prince of Orange overruled him and said, "You will form back into line." The commanding officer, it was after all his senior commander, had no option. And as the battalion formed back in line, they were ridden down by at least a squadron of the charging cuirassiers, which again you can see in the slide there. So the battalion, half in square, half in line, was dispersed by the heavy French cavalry, and of course it was well known really that the King's colour of the 2nd 69th was captured by one of the cuirassiers and taken off. Now, like I say, the extent to which the prince was responsible for this has been quite hotly debated, but there's no doubt that he made a serious error of judgment, and whatever the finer details of quite who said what, there was no doubt that he was the one that made the final decision that the battalion should form into line, and therefore, in many people's judgment, he was responsible for the deaths of the British soldiers and the loss of the colour. So, after quite a successful day, quite a successful battle, it was rather tainted by this single episode that came about after he had given up command of the army and handed back to Wellington take over and for him to take over the First Corps. Okay, so I think that's enough said on that incident and the Battle of Quatre Bras. We'll now move on to Waterloo. Now, on the morning of Waterloo, so on the morning of the 18th, so just hours before the battle, Wellington changed the command structure of the army. Now, the Prince of Orange lost command of the First Corps and was retitled, as you can see there, the commander of the centre. Now, if you look at this map, you can see that the 5 divisions of the First Corps were split by Wellington across the whole frontage and the whole depth of the Allied position. Now, we can only speculate as to why Wellington chose to do this, but it is most probable that he deployed his troops where they would best suit his tactical plan and where he would get best value out of the values of his troops. So I would not take this as anything to do with the prince's capabilities. Indeed, at the end of the day, commanding the very centre of the Allied position was certainly a position of honour, but it also did ensure, bearing in mind that Wellington spent most of the day there, that Wellington could keep his eye on him as well. So let's have a quick look at the prince's key moments at Waterloo. Now, I think the first one, again, is quite well known and revolves around this place, La Haye-Saint. And it involved this man, Colonel Antida, who was the brigade commander of the 2nd King's German Legion Brigade. Now, this incident took place quite late in the afternoon when La Haye-Saint had been captured by the French. Now, Colonel Antida not only commanded the brigade, he was also the honorary colonel of the 5th Line Battalion of the KGL, King's German Legion, because he had once commanded that battalion in the peninsula. Now, after the French had captured the farm in the early evening, Colonel Antida was ordered to counterattack with the 5th King's German Legion, counterattack and try to recapture La Haye-Saint. Now, that order came from General von Alten, who was his divisional commander. Now, he refused, stating that there were French cavalry hidden in the dead ground and that it would be a suicide mission. However, the Prince of Orange then arrived and reiterated von Alten's order. Antida repeated his concerns to the prince, but the prince insisted that the order should be obeyed. Now, Antida's sense of honour, really, I suspect, dictated that not only should the attack then go ahead, but that he should lead it. Sure enough, as I'm sure many of you know, as the battalion advanced forward in line, they were attacked and ridden down by a unit of cuirassiers who indeed had been hidden in the dead ground in the bottom of the valley. In that attack, von Antida was killed, colour was lost of the King's German Legion, and only 17 men of the battalion could be immediately rallied. Now, that effectively destroyed the battalion, certainly as far as that day of battle was concerned. Now, the key thing about this is that this incident had been repeated, had already taken place really, earlier on in the day, and in virtually identical circumstances. So now we move back to the almost to the beginning of the battle, when the French were initially attacking La Haye-Sainte. Now, as you can see there, the French had pretty much surrounded the farm on 3 sides and were threatening to capture it. Now, the Lunenburg Field Battalion, which was a Hanoverian battalion, as you can see in the centre at the bottom, were ordered to advance and drive the French back. Now, the commanding officer was a Lieutenant Colonel von Klenker, and he stated that the order was delivered by an aide-de-camp of the Prince of Orange. Now, in line with his orders, the counterattack was launched in line. It was initially successful. However, as the battalion got mixed up with the troops that were defending the farm, they were charged by those same French cuirassiers, and the battalion was again broken, and many men were ridden down. Now, von Klenker was wounded. The attack was wounded in the attack, and the senior captain was able to rally less than 50 men of the battalion, and he was sent to the rear to try and gather up more. So the battalion was therefore lost to the battle, or lost to the army for the rest of the battle. Now, of course, what we see there, this was the first attack. The destruction of the 5th Line Battalion, the King's German, was the second. And clearly, you've got to ask yourself, had this had happened earlier in the day, it seems unbelievable that exactly the same mistake could have been made, and indeed both having been ordered by the Prince of Orange. Now, after La Haye-Sainte had been captured, which you see there, we're now looking to the north at the top, the French sent forward thick clouds of skirmishers and in fact moved forward 2 artillery pieces as well. And these seriously threatened the very centre of the Allied line that was commanded by the Prince. Now, the Hanoverian and Nassau troops that were deployed in this part of the line were forced back and were in danger of breaking. Now, at this time, the Prince certainly showed his undoubted courage. He was conspicuous in rallying the wavering battalions and leading them back into the front line. And his courage is mentioned by a number of eyewitnesses. For example, Captain von Schreiber of the Hanoverian Bremen Field Battalion, he wrote to the Prince, "The battalion having been driven back towards the end of the battle, we were just in the process of reforming and had succeeded to some extent when His Royal Highness the Crown Prince of the Netherlands came up to us, praised the battalion's conduct and promised to remember us, but at the same time insisted on a quick advance. He would not even allow the completion of our reforming because, as he said, the enemy was in disorder and had been beaten. Our brave troops, unformed, although compact, advanced again with the Prince at their head, shouting, 'Long live the Prince of Orange.'" And actually, General von Kreuser, who commanded the Nassau battalions, from the print that you see on the right there, he wrote, "The Crown Prince of Orange, who commanded on the plateau throughout the battle and had displayed much courage and judgment, now attempted to end it with a bayonet charge and bestowed this honour upon the Nassauers. This attack was undertaken with much courage." But it was whilst leading this counterattack that the Prince was wounded. Indeed, Van Kreuser went on to say, "Caused perhaps by the fall of the wounded Crown Prince, our young men panicked at the very moment of their most splendid victory." So the Prince was shot in the shoulder, as you can see there. He fell from his horse and was evacuated from the battlefield. And that was really the end of his battle. Now, in his Waterloo dispatch, Wellington wrote, "His Royal Highness the Prince of Orange distinguished himself by his gallantry and conduct till he received a wound from a musket ball through the shoulder, which obliged him to leave the field." So it was almost as if the Prince was atoning for his earlier mistakes around La Haye-Sainte. But what did Wellington really think of him? Well, in a secondary source that I've read about him, Wellington described the Prince as a dissolute, untidy and stupid young man. But interestingly, I'm unable to locate a primary source that actually says this, and I suspect that these words have been put into his mouth. A different picture comes from Wellington's dispatches that he wrote from Spain. Now, it must be borne in mind, I think, that these were official reports that may well have been sent on to the Netherlands, and therefore it is unlikely that Wellington was going to be too critical, particularly about a prince. After Waterloo, so after the campaign had finished, Wellington's comments are, I would say, rather more opaque and less gushing. He wrote to the prince himself after the battle as follows. A cynic might say that an impression could be good or bad, but I have no doubt that Wellington was probably saying that it was a good impression. But interestingly, in a private conversation, which was recorded much later after the battle, the prince's military talents were described by Wellington as this. Okay, so from the writings, it's perhaps a little bit more difficult to really know what Wellington's views were. I don't doubt, as we've all picked up there, that there is no doubt that he was very much a brave young man. The big question, I think, is, was he any more than that? But before we move on to, if you like, to my conclusions, I would just like to move on to the epilogue, really, and just talk very briefly about what happened to the prince after his recovery and after the campaign had finished. Many of you might know that in 1830, the Belgians rose in revolt against their Dutch masters, and it was in fact the prince who led the Dutch forces against the Belgian rebels. And after beating the rebels, he was actually then met by French regular forces commanded by General Gerard, who of course had fought in the Waterloo campaign, and they pushed the Dutch back and forced them to sign, eventually sign a treaty. In 1816, he had married the Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna of Russia, and he became King William II only in 1840, so sometime after the battle. So he became king. Unfortunately, he only ruled for 9 years, as he died in March of 1849. Okay, so that sort of brings the story of the prince to an end. And so let's just remind ourselves as when we get to the conclusion. As I said, I've tried to be objective as possible. I suspect some of you might think I haven't been, and I'm very happy to be challenged by that during the questions. I've got to say, I think his bad reputation is more bedded in folklore than in serious histories of the campaign, despite my criticism of some of his lower tactical actions. So let's quickly revisit the title of this presentation. Well, I think a lot depends here, if we were trying to answer that, on what your definition of hero is and what factors we should be considering when we decide whether he was a hero. He was certainly painted as a hero of the Netherlands, as you would expect. And of course, my aim was this. And I think this suggests that perhaps we should be looking to judge him in two different aspects. First of all, his personality, separately to him as a military commander or as a leader. So let's look at those separately. So first of all, let's look at his character. I think there's clear evidence to support the first four in this list. The last one is perhaps a bit more contentious. Certainly what we read or what we heard about him from Clinton, from Hill's ADC, even from Colborne, suggest a certain amount of arrogance. Now, there was no, if you remember, there was no evidence of this in Spain. Everyone liked him. He worked as an aide-de-camp. He had no command. He wasn't lording it, if you like, over other commanders. But of course, from 1814, when he was commander of the Allied forces in the Netherlands, inevitably he'd risen from full colonel to full general. And there he had working for him a number of British officers who were very much more senior to him and very much more experienced. And I think there's no doubt that perhaps some of this arrogance might be put down to the fact that he was having to impose his authority over them, and that is the way, arrogance is the way that they saw that. I leave you to decide. But as far as his personality is concerned, generally speaking, I think certainly when he left Spain, most of the army would have thought he was a pretty good bloke. Okay, let's look now at him as a military commander. This, of course, is probably a bit more contentious. Brave, inspirational, definitely. I don't think anyone would argue with that. And certainly no one could argue that he was lacking in command experience. Indeed, in his 2 years in Spain, he hadn't commanded anything. He had been an aide-de-camp. I certainly think he displayed tactical shortcomings at Quattre and at Waterloo, and we've seen the convincing evidence for this. I think he should certainly have embraced the opportunity to work at brigade level when he was in the peninsula, but of course, very easy for me to sit here and say that. But on the basis that he didn't have that tactical experience or that command experience, then I think we can't be too surprised that he displayed some sort of tactical naivety at times. So, in summary, the truth is that with all such considerations, when we start with two extremes like we do here, the truth generally lies somewhere in the middle. My own conclusion that he was a decent chap, without doubt a very brave man, and with much operational experience. But of course, his lack of command experience at any level made him unfit to command troops in the field. Now, I'm sure that you will all draw your own conclusions. Now, I thought I would just list this. I remember on one of my talks, one of the questions was, what sources did you use? Well, of course, there would normally be a huge list. But I did think I would put the key ones here. Before I show those, I'd just like to say thank you for a couple of people. First of all, to Steve Wright, who helped me with my research, and also the Dutch author who I know is watching, Irvin Milwick. I've already apologized to him for the awful pronunciation of his name. He was good enough to point me in the direction of two biographies of the prince that were written in French, bearing in mind that my Dutch is a little patchy. I apologise for my corruption of your name, Owen. Here, I've listed the key sources that I've used, primarily the Dutch or Belgian sources. The first three are modern ones, and I would certainly recommend all three of them. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Irvin and maybe Pierre Witt as well. But certainly those are must-haves, really, if you're seriously looking at the Netherlands' contribution to the campaign. The next two, Lobensel's and Debat, are both old histories, Dutch-Belgian histories written mid-19th century and early 20th century. And I mustn't forget Gareth's work with the Waterloo Archive series, which includes English translations of many of the Dutch or Belgian accounts of the campaign. And on that basis, John, I throw myself at people's mercy.
I'm sure you don't need to do that, Andrew. That was, as always, a wonderful, and I know you said some people might not think it very balanced, but I think everybody here will agree it was a very, very well balanced account. I've already got questions coming in here. I'm going to ask one from Neil, which says, do you think that the events of the 14th and 15th of June showed the Prince reverting to type, i.e. dashing around as an energetic staff officer, as he'd done with some success in the peninsula?
Okay, interesting. This, of course, was his first chance to show his command credentials. And I think what we must remember is the difficulty of communications in those days. And before hostility has broken out, then I'm sure the Prince was doing the right thing when we look at the 14th and the 15th, getting out and about, visiting his troops, checking that discipline was being maintained, checking that they were practicing their concentrations as they had been ordered to do. And so I would be hard pressed to judge him too harshly on that. As I think I made clear in my talk, I'm a little bit more concerned that he chose that he should be the man to take the news to the Duke of Wellington up in Brussels when the first attacks appeared on the border, and the first news that started coming in that the French were attacking up the Brussels road directly towards his troops. So I think perhaps he made an error of judgment in zooming up to Brussels and then to stay for the ball, because it left his junior commanders, i.e. Constant Rebecque and Paponchet, to have to make the crucial decisions to concentrate troops at Quattre in direct contradiction to the orders that were sent by Wellington for those troops to concentrate at Nivelles.
I've got some more questions coming in, but I just want to ask one question on here, which seems to be, you know, if you look at, say, the performance of the French Royal Army in the 18th century, you know, kings would turn up to claim the credit for the victory, but would very carefully leave the actual work to somebody like the Marquis de Saxe, you know, someone who could get the job done. Is the problem with the Prince of Orange that he's promoted above himself for political reasons? In other words, does his father say, I want my son to have this position?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that he was grossly over-promoted as far as his military capabilities were concerned. But as I think I said early on, it wasn't unusual for princes and dukes to be promoted quickly and not to go through that long apprenticeship that British Army officers did, of starting off at the very lowest levels as a second lieutenant or an ensign, and then working your way up to command of a company, and then second command of a battalion, and then a battalion, and then a brigade, and so on. And you do question, particularly as an ex-military man now, you know, how you could have been thrown into that level of command without having had any of that experience. Maybe people felt it wasn't unusual in those days, but like I say, for someone with some military experience behind me, 40 odd years, then you know, I feel that extremely strange. And yes, by all means, give them honorary titles, make them generals, but certainly don't give them chief commands on operations.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got a question in here from Zach White. Exceptional presentation. Thank you, Andrew. Do you think there are any commanders at Waterloo who represent the reverse of the Prince of Orange's situation, i.e. praise too much for a mediocre performance?
Yeah, I think it's always difficult this far removed, 200 years or so, to know, to understand, to be able to really get in people's heads. You know, I've read out some of the accounts there praising the Duke and the Prince, and there were others. But of course, those were sort of written in retrospect when the victory had been won, and everyone could pretty much clap themselves on the back and perhaps seek recognition from senior officers by praising their performance. You know, the fact of the matter is, Wellington didn't organise his army in corps as command at Waterloo, and for me, you know, saying you're commander of the centre sounds very grand, but it's not laid down exactly who he commanded as commander of the centre. We know that to the east of the Brussels road, all troops to the east came under command of Picton, who was a divisional commander, and he commanded at least 2 divisions, over 3 divisions probably of troops as a divisional commander. And of course, Hill commanded on the extreme left. So I'm not quite clear in my mind what the centre was. The 2 British divisions, so the Guards division and von Alten's 3rd division, the British and Hanoverian elements of that, seem to be working to orders from Wellington, and all the mentions of the Prince at Waterloo tend to come from the Nassauers and the Hanoverians in the very centre. So that seemed to be, he kept very much to that centre, and when his own, if you like, his own Netherlands troops to the east of the road were broken, it was Constant Rebecque that was sent over there to rally them and to lead them back into the line. So I think the Prince kept himself very much to the very centre of the line, and like I've said, very courageously led both Hanoverian and Nassau troops into counterattacks before he was wounded. So not short of courage, perhaps not so astute a military commander.
I've got a specific question from David Maloney here. Can you put a date on when the Prince received his Army Gold Medal?
No. I don't know where I would find that in the sources that I've got. There may be people out there that know the answer to that, someone like Irvin perhaps, and there are one or two other people I know I've corresponded with that have a much deeper knowledge of the Netherlands Army than I do. You could see that it was applied for in 1812 when he'd only had, if you like, 3 clasps that he was entitled to. So the answer, so that long-winded answer is no, I don't, I'm afraid, David.
I've got a question from Brian Subble now. As you know, Brian is not the greatest devotee of Wellington that has ever lived. And he says, begs the question of where was Wellington when La Haye Sainte fell? Why was he not where he was needed to support or counter the Prince's efforts?
Okay, well, my understanding is that towards that end of the battle, Wellington had moved over further to the west, to behind the right, behind the Guards division, that sort of area there, because I know that when the 3rd Division withdrew from the front line, as I've talked about before, it was a staff officer that rode over in that direction to inform him. So I feel that probably Wellington was further to the west, watching the great cavalry attacks and the repulse of the cavalry attacks, and perhaps a reorganization and redeployment of the infantry on the Allied right when La Haye Sainte fell. So I suspect that's where he was. I'm not someone who thinks that Wellington didn't commit any errors during the campaign, and I know that, you know, in many of the refutations that were written by Dutch and Belgian senior officers after the campaign in response to the general insults that were thrown at the Netherlands troops during the campaign, much of their defense rests on the mistakes that Wellington made during the campaign, rather than the sort of fighting capacity of the Dutch and the Belgian troops, or the Netherlands troops as they're rightly called. Yeah, I'm not a great defender of Wellington in particular, but I think certainly his management of the battle on the whole was pretty good. So I would, you know, I would be a bit loath to criticise Wellington for not being there at that particular moment.
Thank you. There's as you can see from the chat, there's a big discussion about the cross and the gold medal, reference being made to the London Gazette, but also Irwin, who was delighted to join the Waterloo Association as a new member, as indeed are 4 attendees on this session. Irwin says, I've never come across his medal being mentioned, nor is it in possession of the family. So there we go. Mike Robertson saying, interesting talk. I think Constable Beck's contribution in the campaign is underrated. Sometimes a commander with limitations can be saved by a subordinate with skills to complement them, and Blucher and these are now there. Loads of things saying, excellent presentation. Thanks to you as always. Thank you for a fascinating talk, Andrew. I'm not going to go through them all, sir, because we'll be here far too long, and you know it will be midnight, but I'm going to pick up one more question, if I may, which is from John Haynes. If he had been his corps, do you think he would have, sorry, I've lost that there. I'm not doing very well on the chat aspect here because I've got so many questions coming in, so sorry. I'm going to drop to Dennis, who's asked, were there any similarly young and inexperienced commanders that we know about that are fighting during the Napoleonic and Peninsula Wars?
Oh, blimey, there were many. I think probably let's stick to Waterloo, because a good example here is Saxe-Weimar, Colonel Saxe-Weimar, was it Bernard, I think, Saxe-Weimar, who commanded a brigade in the 2nd Netherlands Division, the 2nd Division. They were exclusively Nassau troops, the Orange Nassau Regiment of the Netherlands Army, and the 2nd Nassau Regiment. And he was 23, and it was his brigade that was actually at Quattre when the French advanced across the border and towards Quattre. And he is sort of credited with saying to his troops as the French advance, well, as a campaign rarely opens with a retreat, or I've never heard of a campaign opening with a retreat, then I think we should stay here and defend the crossroads. And that was a 23-year-old. He had rather more experience with the French army than the Prince of Orange did. But there was a young member of a royal family commanding at brigade level rather than army level, and I know that there are many others, not least of course Prince Jerome on the French side, who was divisional commander, Napoleon's younger brother, and perhaps he rather embarrassed himself in his constant attacks on Huguenot, and so perhaps that reinforces generally people of younger or more limited military experience probably suffer more in the big battles than those that have grown up in the army.
That is absolutely brilliant. I've got John Hainsey here. A repeated question. If he had been with his corps, do you think he would have made the decision to ignore Wellington's orders? Perhaps it was better he wasn't there.
Yeah, well, of course, that's one of the big what ifs. I think we mustn't underestimate the influence that Constant Rebecque probably had over him. And I have a feeling, I like to think, I think it was Mike that was saying we've underrated Constant Rebecque, and I couldn't agree more. Although he had no great combat experience. In fact, I think he had no combat experience, real combat experience. But I think if the Prince had been there, I sort of feel that Constant Rebecque would have convinced the Prince that that would have been the right thing to do. And I think it would have been quite a brave Prince to say no, but it's one of those things that we'll never know.
Great. Andrew, thank you. Andrew, you have a book coming out. Tell us about it.
Okay, well, some of you might have heard the talk that I gave on called Wellington's Waterloo Allies, that looked in detail at the Netherlands contribution, the Hanoverian contribution, the Nassau contribution, the Brunswick contribution, and I'd looked specifically at that. What I found is in my research for that presentation, and then further research that I conducted afterwards, because my interest was rather pricked by that, that I realized that there was certainly a book crying out to be written on that, just to make sure these people were given the recognition that perhaps they hadn't really got in past histories in the very anglocentric accounts. So that's due out. It was due out in April, but I think because of COVID, it slipped a little bit because they're printed in India. So I think it might be May or even June. But that will come out then, and I really hope that that will be well received, and I hope people feel I've done due credit to those contingents, which made up, let's face it, 70% of Wellington's army at Waterloo.
Fantastic. I'm just going to refer, because Erwin's just put a post on here. We should get Constant Rebecque's journal of the years in Spain and get it translated into English. So that might be revealing. Well,
I mean, that would be fantastic. And I think what I wanted to do when I put that slide up of the Dutch and Belgian historians was to try and get out there not only what is available in English, but also the work that these people have been doing, like Erwin, have been doing in getting that information into English, so that we can appreciate it. So I'm a great supporter of that, and unfortunately my Dutch is only, I think, a single word. So I'm afraid I won't be able to help him. I won't be able to help him with that, but that would be brilliant.
Fantastic. Do you want to do a plug for your talk at the National Army Museum?
Well, a week on Friday, is that the 14th? I'm due to speak at the National Army Museum in London. It's a talk about the French perspective of Waterloo, which you know, I'm sure many people might have read from my book already. It's to a more generalist audience, but if there's anyone in London looking for something to do next Friday, I would recommend that. And I think it is being put online, but I think that's just to sort of friends of the museum. But I think if you go to the museum, you can just go and sit in the talk, and it's advertised on the National Army Museum website. If you want to take a look, it'd be great.
That is really, really super. Andrew's tour de force as always. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Great presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Happy New Year, everybody.